My name is Emily Gardner. I was 31 when I returned to Denver for my father's funeral event that, despite the black lace and closed doors, felt more like a company reception than a moment of mourning. The air inside the chapel was thick with cologne, ambition, and a muted, judgmental silence. I arrived alone, early, and unacknowledged. No one offered a seat. No one met my eyes. I chose a place near the back and watched the room fill with sharp suits and practiced grief. Most of them knew who I was, or thought they did. Raymond Gardner had been many things: a respected real estate developer, a civic donor, a public figure. To most, he was the man who reshaped downtown Denver, converting obsolete mills and warehouse blocks into glass and steel monuments of commerce. To me, he had once been a father. Long before press conferences and strategic partnerships consumed him, he used to drive me through the city at night, pointing out sites that didn't yet exist. Speaking about blueprints like they were chapters in a novel, I used to believe I understood him. I used to think I was a part of that vision. But by the time the minister began reciting the eulogy, I understood exactly where I stood. Daniel, my father's son from his second marriage, sat in the front pew with his arm folded stiffly against his press suit. He hadn't looked my way once since I entered. Beside him sat people I had once considered family, now only familiar strangers. They nodded as if choreographed, dabbing at dry eyes and whispering condolences into their own reflections. What struck me most wasn't the coldness. I had learned to live with that. It was the precision of it, the way everything had been arranged, decided, rehearsed without me. The way my name was never mentioned, not in the printed program, not by the efficient, not even in the brief biography that traced my father's legacy through Daniel's career in the corporate molesto ness of Gardner West. It was as though I had been cut from the film reel of his life and left on the editing room floor. I didn't cry, I didn't speak. I simply sat and watched as the life of a man I once adored was packaged into digestible sound bites, measured out like a quarterly report. It was only when the service ended and the crowd moved to the reception hall that I finally allowed myself to breathe. But before I could leave, a familiar figure emerged from the side aisle. Harold Brenner, my father's longtime attorney, stood waiting with a manila envelope and a faint, unreadable expression. He approached me quietly and handed over a sealed folder, thick and heavy. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. I knew what it was the moment I felt its weight. Something my father had left behind, something none of them had expected to surface. Not here, not now, and certainly not in my hands. Asterisk, I didn't open the envelope that night. Not immediately. I placed it in the desk drawer of my rented hotel room, the kind with flickering lamps and a mini bar that hummed loudly. Instead of reading it, I lay awake with the lights off, listening to the city outside my window and wondering when, exactly, I had become a stranger to my own family. Sleep never came. The next morning, I found myself walking along the edge of City Park, where my father used to take me on Saturdays. Years ago, the skyline was different now, his work visible in every reflective panel and concrete angle. A city shaped by his ambition, but haunted in its symmetry by the things left unsaid. I watched a pair of joggers pass, a dog chasing a thrown stick. It occurred to me that none of them knew my name, and that perhaps the anonymity was a kind of freedom. Back at the hotel, I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a simple type note in Harold Sharp, controlled script, paper clipped to a USB drive, and a copy of a revised legal will. The note said only that the contents were to be reviewed privately, in full, before the scheduled family reading 2 days later. I didn't question it. I didn't tell anyone. I waited until evening, drew the blackout curtains, and plugged the drive into my laptop. The video began without preamble. No title, no timestamp, just my father, seated behind his desk at the study in our old house, the one I hadn't set foot in for nearly 7 years. The room was almost painfully unchanged. Same wall of law books he never read. Same brass lamp with the shade tilted slightly left. He wore a navy blazer over a charcoal sweater, a combination he used to call his public-facing armor. His face looked thinner than I remembered, but his eyes sharp, calculating, and oddly tired watched me through the screen with an intensity I couldn't meet. He began by naming the date, just under 3 months before his death. Then he paused, folding his hands on the desk, and said he was recording this not as a gesture of drama, but as a correction of history, a personal one, a legal one, and something else, something he didn't quite define. He spoke first of Daniel. He said that for a long time, he had believed in a version of events that had made sense to him, that Daniel had stepped up when others wouldn't, that I had distanced myself, willfully, that some bonds, even familial ones, didn't survive misalignment of values. He didn't sound accusatory. Not yet, more like someone sorting through receipts long after the return window had closed. Then his voice changed, just slightly. He said that after a mild cardiac episode that spring nothing serious. He claimed he began working from home more often, with less time in the office. He had grown curious about inconsistencies in correspondence, missed meetings, and conversations that didn't line up. One afternoon, looking for old contracts in the home filing cabinet, he'd stumbled on something unexpected, a collection of letters and cards addressed to him, all unopened, all from me. He didn't show them. He didn't need to. I remembered them. The birthday card with the blue ink stain, the holiday note with the photograph of my new apartment, the invitation to my first reading at an independent bookstore in Brooklyn, where 5 people showed up and one of them fell asleep. He had them. He'd seen them, just not when I'd hoped he would. He said nothing for a moment after that. His fingers touched the edge of the desk, then retreated. He looked down, and for the first time in the video, his shoulders slumped ever so slightly. Then he said he'd started asking questions. The questions led to other discoveries, call logs that didn't match his memory, voicemails that had disappeared, email filters he hadn't said. He admitted that he wasn't a tech-savvy man, but he knew when something was off. That was when he quietly hired a third-party investigator, someone outside the firm, outside the company, with no ties to Daniel or anyone in the family. The findings were presented to him in a locked briefcase. He didn't describe them in detail, at least not yet. Instead, he said only that what he learned reshaped his understanding of loyalty, manipulation, and the boundaries of trust. Then he said something I wasn't prepared for. He said he had intended to visit me. He'd been planning a trip to New York the week after our last phone call, the one where he'd sounded distant, uninterested. I remembered that call vividly. I'd told him about a short story I'd published in a literary journal. He had responded with silence, then pivoted to a new contract Daniel had landed with the Department of Transportation. I'd hung up that night thinking I would never call again, but he'd already booked a flight. He'd planned to show up at my apartment unannounced, sit in the back row of a reading, maybe walk with me through the corner of Brooklyn I had once told him reminded me of his early construction sites, bare-boned, grimy, full of potential. That visit never happened. He said his health declined again, said the trip had to be postponed, said he never rescheduled. There was no apology, not directly, but his face spoke something quieter. Something I had never seen in him before, regret, without defensiveness. He spoke then of legacy, of what it meant to build something lasting, not in dollars or square footage, but in decisions that withstood scrutiny. He said he had always believed that Daniel, with his composure and drive, was the right heir to Gardner West. But now, that belief no longer held. Again, he didn't explain why. Not yet. Instead, he spoke of the values he'd built the company on. He repeated a line I hadn't heard since I was 15, scribbling poetry in a corner of his office while he worked through floor plans. Nothing unsound should stand, not in structure, not in principle. He said that's why he had rewritten his will. The screen faded to black then, and I thought for a moment that it had ended, but it resumed same angle, same man. Hours later, by the shift in light, he looked more composed now, more resolved. He said that in the final version of his estate plan, he'd made a series of changes, some financial, some structural, some personal. These changes, he said, would be explained in full by Harold during the official reading. Then, in a quieter tone, he addressed me again. He said he had followed my career from a distance, that he had read my work under a pseudonym I used online, that he had recognized my voice in it, that there were moments he was proud, and moments he was afraid of how far we had drifted. But he never stopped watching. He never stopped wondering if there would be a way back. He didn't say he loved me, but for the first time in years, I believed he had. The video ended. The screen turned black again. This time for good. I sat there in the silence, the weight of the room pressing in around me, the laptop's fan humming softly in the stillness. The folder still lay open beside me on the bed, the printed will untouched. I didn't reach for it. Not yet. The morning of the will reading arrived without ceremony. The sky was a neutral gray, the kind that flattened light and erased shadows. I dressed with deliberate simplicity, black slacks, a wool coat, low-heeled shoes. I left my hair down. The mirror gave nothing away. At the last moment, I reached for a thin chain with a small pendant my mother had given me years ago, long before her name was replaced on the mailbox outside our old home. It felt neither sentimental nor strategic, just appropriate. The car ride to the law firm was quiet. I didn't ask the driver to take the long way. I didn't check my phone. There was nothing to delay. From the backseat window, I watched the grid of Denver's commercial district pass by buildings I had once known by name, now abstracted into steel and tinted glass. Somewhere in that skyline was the last office my father worked from. Somewhere beneath it was the foundation he'd once thought indestructible. The offices of Keller and Bryan occupied the top floor of a building my father had funded, but never branded. I'd walked past it many times over the years without ever noticing the discreet gold lettering on the corner plaque. The elevator was silent as it rose. At the 42nd floor, the doors opened into a waiting area of hushed carpeting and matte paneling. A receptionist offered a polite nod. No one else spoke. They were already inside when I entered the conference room. The long glass table had been arranged with exacting symmetry, folders at each place. Bottles of water unopened. Daniel sat at the head, a subtle assertion. Beside him, a semicircle of familiar profiles. Uncle Terrence and Lydia, to members of the Gardner West executive team, and someone I assumed was legal counsel. None of them looked up immediately. The only person who greeted me was Harold. He stood as I entered, gestured quietly toward the seat at the far end of the table. The placement didn't offend me. It simply confirmed the narrative everyone else had already agreed upon. I said, straight-backed, hands folded in my lap. My father's revised will sat inside my bag, unread, round me. Conversation resumed in low tones. Daniel was speaking about an urban renewal project in Aurora, how it would be his first initiative as managing partner. Someone chuckled in agreement. Someone else murmured approval. I noted who responded and who remained silent. I didn't speak. When Harold called the room to order, the shift was subtle but immediate, eyes focused. Devices were silenced. Even Daniel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed in what could be mistaken freeze. Harold's tone was measured as he began his preamble. He spoke of my father's legacy, of the firm's responsibility, of the legal process. There was a phrase about transparency, another about truth. I listened without blinking. No one noticed the small notepad in front of me remained blank. The announcement of the video was met with predictable surprise. Some exchanged glances. Daniel's jaw tightened, and Lydia made a sound that might have been amusement or concern. Harold explained the instructions clearly. The video would be played before any documents were reviewed. No interruptions, no discussion until after it concluded. I waited, still and quiet, as the lights dimmed and the projector flickered to life. But I already knew what was coming. The version I had seen was unedited. This one, by design, was not. I studied the room as the video began, the camera's angle, the familiar background. My father's voice, none of it pulled me in. Instead, I watched how others reacted. Uncle Terrence leaned forward slightly. The board member closest to Daniel began tapping a pen against his knee, then stopped. Daniel himself didn't move, but the vein at his temple shifted with each passing minute. When my father mentioned me by name, the silence thickened. Some turned toward me instinctively, as if to verify I was still there. I met no one's gaze. I kept my hands folded. My breathing stayed, even. Nothing in my expression changed. My father's disclosures unfolded in sequence. The letters, the messages, the interference, the investigation. Each layer peeled back with quiet inevitability. There was no performance. In his voice, just clarity. No defense, no embellishment. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was leaving the record behind. I watched as the illusion began to erode. The shift was not immediate, but it was visible. Daniel's posture began to harden. His lips pressed thin. His fingers tightened slightly around the armrest. For a brief moment, I thought he might speak, but he didn't. Not yet. When my father outlined the changes to his estate, the mood changed. A pause swept through the room like a held breath. 54% of Gardner West transferred to me. The primary residence, a foundation in my name, oversight provisions for Daniel, ethical compliance requirements, consequences outlined with legal precision. Still, I made no reaction. Not when the board members turned to each other. Not when someone at the far end exhaled sharply. Not even when Harold paused the video to restore the lights. In that moment, everyone in the room was waiting for a response. Perhaps they expected disbelief, gratitude, vindication, something. But I gave them nothing. I thanked Harold with a nod. I did not look at Daniel. I did not adjust my posture. I reached for the water bottle and took a measured sip. The room, unsettled, searched for an anchor. I declined to offer one. No one asked why. I wasn't surprised. They wouldn't have understood the answer. Later, during the recess Harold called for, I remained seated while others stepped out in clusters. I listened to their voices just beyond the glass wall, overlapping and subdued. Daniel had not left the room. He remained in his chair, unmoving, his focus turned inward. I didn't speak to him. I didn't need to. The silence between us now held more weight than any confrontation could. I opened my notebook then, for the first time, and wrote a single sentence, just one. I tore out the page, folded it, and placed it into the inner pocket of my coat. Then I closed the notebook and waited. Not for permission, not for the others to return. I waited because everything that needed to happen next had already begun. When the meeting resumed, the room was quieter, though not calmer. The difference was subtle but unmistakable, like the space after a sudden drop in barometric pressure, nothing visible. Yet every surface felt more fragile. People returned to their seats slower than before, their conversations clipped. Uncertain, no one resumed the previous small talk. The air had changed. Harold opened a leather folder and began the formal reading of the revised will. He read without inflection, as though delivering news of no emotional weight, though his words caused a visible shift in posture, expressions, and breath. Each clause landed like the chime of a distant bell, not loud, but final. At first, there were just glances. The board members exchanged them with increasing frequency. Aunt Lydia shifted her handbag across her lap, as though to create some kind of barrier. Uncle Terrence stared at the table's reflection. Jaw clenched, Daniel remained fixed in place, though his hand now tapped an unsteady rhythm against the leg of his chair, clause by clause. My father's instructions became less theoretical and more executable. The transfer of ownership, the structure of the Gardner West Foundation, the escrow arrangement, the designation of controlling interest. There was no ambiguity, no loopholes. Somewhere around the midpoint, Daniel stood abruptly. His chair scraped the floor with a sharp metallic shriek. The sound cut through the quiet like a fracture. For a moment, no one moved. His expression was unreadable, composed on the surface, but stretched at the corners. He didn't address anyone. He simply left the room. The door didn't slam. That would have implied certainty. Instead, it clicked softly behind him. No one followed. Harold continued. After the final page was turned and the reading concluded, he closed the folder, rested his hands on the table, and said nothing further. His silence served as a signal. The legal work was complete. What remained was interpretation. Consequence, I stayed seated as the rest began to react. Uncle Terence was the first to speak, not to me, but to the general vicinity. A low mutter of disbelief, followed by a series of fragmented questions directed at no one in particular, and Lydia attempted a placating gesture, her voice pitched high, as if volume might soften the reality. One of the board members asked to see the supporting documentation. Another requested clarification on the ethics oversight provision. Someone raised the issue of continuity. There were nods, contradictions, murmurs. The architecture of certainty began to fold. No one addressed me directly. They circled the matter, searching for explanations that didn't require acknowledging my presence. I let them. Outside the window, the weather had shifted, sunlight filtering in through clouds that had begun to break apart. The city below carried on, unaware of the slow collapse occurring 42 stories above. By the time the meeting formally adjourned, the atmosphere had turned clinical. People gathered their belongings with an air of unfinished business. Some left quickly, others lingered, as if hoping someone else would take responsibility for framing what had just happened. I stood, adjusted the collar of my coat, and thanked Harold with a brief nod. He returned it without words. In the hallway, I passed Daniel. He stood alone near the elevator, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on nothing. He did not speak. Neither did I. The elevator arrived. He didn't enter. By the time I reached the street, my phone had begun to vibrate. Messages, missed calls, inquiries from unknown numbers. I turned it off. I wasn't ready to narrate the story they all now wanted to hear. I walked instead through streets I had once memorized, now altered slightly by time and construction, past buildings bearing my father's name, projects he had spoken of as though they were living things. I passed one with a lobby wrapped in temporary fencing, the kind that suggested pending renovations or hidden faults. I paused, studied the structure, noted the lines where old materials met new. Then I kept walking. News traveled fast. Within 48 hours, articles began circulating, neutral headlines layered with speculative subtext. Industry blogs first, then business journals, then mainstream outlets. The tone varied. Some framed the story as unexpected. Others called it overdue. All of them quoted unnamed sources. By the end of the week, I had received a formal letter from the board requesting an introductory meeting. The language was polite, measured, but the urgency was clear. They needed to know what would happen next, whether I intended to lead, whether I could. I replied without delay. At the meeting, I answered their questions succinctly. I did not over-explain. I did not elaborate on my intentions beyond what the documents already outlined. I confirmed I would assume control of the foundation immediately. Regarding the company, I said only that I would honor my father's wishes, and that integrity would define the next phase. They didn't ask for more. They simply nodded. Later that day, I walked through the executive offices of Gardner West for the first time since college. The layout had changed. The art on the walls had changed. But the feeling clinical ambition masked by strategic decor remained. I was greeted with courtesy, deference, but also caution. A few smells were too wide, a few silences too calculated. I walked the corridors alone. I did not ask for a tour. By the time I entered what had once been my father's office, someone had already cleared the desk. The nameplate was gone. The shelves were empty. There were no photographs, no trace of his presence, just the outline where his chair had pressed into the carpet for decades. I stood in the center of the room for a while. I didn't sit. A few days later, A memo was sent to all senior staff outlining the upcoming review of ongoing projects. It was co-signed by me and the interim operations lead, someone who had once worked closely with my father, but never with Daniel. The language of the memo was simple compliance, transparency, audit schedule, but it was enough. It said what needed to be said. That weekend, I returned to the house. I moved through its halls quietly, noting how little had changed. A pair of cufflinks left on the bureau. A stack of architectural magazines, dog-eared. In the study, I found a drawer I hadn't opened in years. Inside were notes, correspondence, a single photograph of us, laminated under glass. I didn't linger. I placed the photo back in the drawer, closed it, and walked upstairs. That night, I sat at the desk in my childhood bedroom and began drafting the charter for the Gardner West Foundation. The mission statement was brief, focused, specific. The room was silent. I wrote until morning. The months that followed settled into a rhythm that didn't resemble peace, but something close to forward motion. There was always something to review, someone to meet, some document to revise. The work filled the spaces that once echoed with uncertainty. I moved with purpose, not speed. That seemed to unsettle some people more than if I had arrived with grand declarations. The first formal board meeting after the transition felt less like a trial than I'd expected. The tone was restrained, professional. The agenda stayed focused on infrastructure assessments, delayed project reports, and departmental turnover. No one mentioned the past directly, but traces of it linger in the way certain sentences trail off before becoming questions, in the overly polite acknowledgments when I offered insight, in the pauses that marked the space where objections might have lived. Before the video, I offered clear answers. When I didn't know something, I said so plainly, and asked for documentation. That seemed to shift the atmosphere. I didn't attempt to impress them. I didn't need to. They began, slowly, to recalibrate their expectations. One by one, senior managers began reaching out, first through cautious emails, then quiet conversations behind closed doors. Some came with concerns about contracts, vendor behavior, budget allocations under Daniel's oversight. Others asked about the foundation, curious whether there might be collaboration opportunities. The guarded tone in their voices didn't go unnoticed, but I answered every inquiry without posturing or apology. The ethics audit began in earnest. Harold assembled a small team of external advisors, none with previous ties to Gardner West. I reviewed every report myself. I didn't assign blame. I didn't grant immunity. I documented what needed fixing, and I committed to transparency. When certain suppliers were flagged for questionable practices, their contracts were terminated, even when that meant delaying project timelines. Some board members resisted. They argued margins. They questioned the optics. But as the headlines from the earlier weeks receded, what remained was the structure of trust slowly being reassembled. In the third month, I was asked to speak at a closed session of the Colorado Urban Renewal Council. I accepted without hesitation. The presentation focused on community impact metrics, not legacy. I offered numbers, results, plans, not philosophies. Afterward, one of the directors approached me, extended a hand, and said only that my father would have recognized the clarity in the work. I didn't respond with sentiment. I nodded once, and we moved on. Around that same time, I received a letter postmarked from a nonprofit I hadn't heard of, an organization focused on civic architecture education. They had followed the news, they said, and were interested in featuring the Gardner West Foundation's new scholarship program in their quarterly journal. I reviewed the draft article and made only one correction. The spotlight should include the design students who had already submitted proposals, not just the structure funding them. One morning, I passed a framed copy of the journal on the wall. In the lobby, no one had mentioned it. No one had asked for permission. It had simply appeared evidence of quiet integration. Daniel's name was no longer mentioned in meetings. His office had been reassigned. Staff who had been aligned with him either departed quietly or adjusted to the new protocols. I did not ask after him. I did not monitor his movements. The distance between us had calcified into something less volatile, more permanent. Family, however, was not so easily set aside. It began with a card, no signature, no message, only a typed quote from an old architecture book we used to have at home. I didn't reply. A few weeks later, an email from Aunt Lydia appeared in my inbox. Its subject line blank. She asked to meet for coffee, to speak, in person, to clear the air. I declined, not with malice, only clarity. Other relatives followed similar patterns. Some wanted to express regret. Others tested whether proximity might offer benefit. Again, I met each gesture with measured neutrality. Those who came out of guilt found no absolution. Those who came with humility found space for limited reconciliation. The house remained unchanged. I had not moved impermanently, though I stayed there when business kept me in Denver overnight. The rooms were still heavy with a kind of static memory, but less haunting now. One evening, I discovered an envelope tucked behind a bookshelf in the study. Inside were clippings from articles about my writing, some published anonymously, others from small literary zines. My father had kept them, dated them. There were notes in the margins, observations, questions, pride, never stated, but implied. I filed the envelope away with other personal documents, not as proof of anything, but as record. By the 6th month, the Gardner West Foundation hosted its first public forum. It was held at a refurbished civic hall downtown, a structure my father had once helped preserve. The audience included community leaders, artists, architects, students. The event wasn't flashy. The program was simple panel discussions, open Q&A, a presentation of the first round of grant recipients. I stood at the podium only briefly, offering a welcome address that avoided personal history. I spoke of mission, structure, transparency. I ended with an invitation. Proposals would be reviewed quarterly. Regardless of size or reputation, ideas would be measured by viability, not affiliation. I left the stage without applause, but the room remained quiet, attentive. That silence was enough. After the forum, a woman approached me in the corridor. She introduced herself as a former city planner, now mentoring first-generation students in a community college program. She said the foundation structure reminded her of models that had been dismissed years ago as unrealistic. She said it was good to see someone trying again. Her words were even, but carried weight. I thanked her, and we stood together for a while, saying nothing more. In the weeks that followed, more correspondence arrived, invitations, requests for collaboration, press inquiries, most of which I declined. I remained present, but not public, visible, but not performative. It seemed to work. One morning, I walked through the east wing of the company's new headquarters, a building completed 2 years before my father's passing. I paused near a wall of glass where staff often gathered during breaks. A junior analyst nodded to me as she passed, holding a blueprint marked with annotations. Someone else mentioned a supplier I'd flagged in a recent memo, noting the adjustment had already improved logistics. No one stumbled over my name. No one asked why I was there. I kept walking. Back in my office, the framed photo from my childhood, my father in his hard hat, holding blueprints, with his arm draped awkwardly round my shoulder, sat tucked behind a stack of reports. I hadn't displayed it. I hadn't hidden it either. It simply remained, quiet and unassuming, like a placeholder from another draft of my life. That afternoon, the board sent a formal message of endorsement. The language was restrained, but deliberate. They supported the strategic redirection of Gardner West. They endorsed the foundation structure. They acknowledged my leadership without condition. I printed the message and filed it away. Outside, the city pulsed in its usual cadence. Cranes dotted the skyline. Traffic moved below in steady lines. From this distance, the noise became a hum, neither invasive nor ignorable. I looked out over the glass, and for a moment, saw no fault lines, only the possibility of continued form. 6 months after I assumed control of the Gardner West Foundation, I was invited to speak at a leadership symposium hosted by the Colorado Civic Forum, a gathering known less for its spotlight and more for its substance. I hadn't sought out the invitation. It arrived by letter, printed on thick stationery, signed by a former city planner who'd once challenged my father's zoning decisions in a public hearing. The irony didn't escape me, but the tone of the invitation was genuine, thoughtful. It wasn't a request for spectacle. It was an opening for reflection. I hesitated before accepting, not out of fear or doubt, but because I understood what it meant to tell a story after the silence had served its purpose. To turn a private reckoning into a public lesson meant exposing not just the betrayal and correction, but the distance between who I had been and who I had become. I wasn't certain I owed that to anyone, but perhaps, in some small way, I owed it to the younger version of myself, the one who once believed she'd been erased. The event took place in an old municipal building that had been restored into a civic hall. The architecture was spare, but elegant vaulted ceilings, soft acoustics, pale wood paneling. I arrived early. The audience filtered in quietly. Educators, nonprofit directors, policy advisors. A handful of journalists. Most of them didn't know the full story, just fragments they'd read or heard. I wasn't there to confirm or correct. I was there to speak about resilience in leadership. That's how the invitation had phrased it. When my name was introduced, there was a pause, not for applause, but for recognition, the kind that isn't about fame, but about having quietly remained in place long enough for others to catch up to your presence. I walked to the podium without notes. I began not with the company or the foundation, but with a memory one from my early 20s. Sitting on the floor of a studio apartment in Chicago, reading rejection letters from literary journals, I described the feeling of being overlooked not because your work lacked merit, but because it didn't fit someone else's framework. I said that sometimes leadership doesn't begin with clarity, it begins with entrance, not knowing where you belong, but refusing to disappear. As I spoke, I noticed the way people listened, not leaning forward with anticipation, but sitting back, considering. That was enough. I did not name names. I did not speak of Daniel, or my family, or even the video that had become a silent axis in the story. I spoke about systems, how they resist change until they are forced to accommodate it. I spoke about legacy not as inheritance, but as accountability. And I spoke about the long, quiet work of restoring credibility when someone else has taken it from you. After the session, several attendees approached. Some offered only a thank you. Others asked about the foundation's programs, or the scholarship recipients, or whether our blueprint could be replicated elsewhere. One woman handed me a copy of a policy brief she'd written years ago on ethics reform in private development. She said she'd never thought it would find relevance. I told her it had. In the weeks that followed, I was invited to contribute a short piece to a civic leadership journal. They asked for a personal reflection on values in business. I kept the tone measured. I wrote about decisions made in rooms where not everyone is visible, about the quiet harm of exclusion, and the quieter strength required to return with purpose rather than anger. The response surprised me, not in volume, but in depth. Letters arrived from people I'd never met, some recounting similar experiences, others asking how to begin their own process of reclaiming trust. I answered most of them, briefly, but sincerely. One letter stood out. It was from a high school teacher in Ohio who had used excerpts from my article to prompt a class discussion about fairness. She included a few handwritten notes from her students, many of whom had never heard of Gardner West, or Denver, or my name. One student had written, "It made me feel like being underestimated might not be permanent." I kept that one thought at the foundation. The second round of grants moved forward. The board no longer hesitated before decisions. The staff operated without whispers. The new initiatives took shape slowly, deliberately. Not everything worked, but what did was meaningful. One afternoon, I walked through the east-facing wing of our main office. where a rotating gallery of community art had been installed. A volunteer from a youth program was leading a small group of students through the corridor, explaining the intention behind each piece. I paused a few steps behind them and noticed, watching as one student pointed to a canvas and said, almost offhandedly, that it looked like someone telling the truth, even if nobody believed them yet. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. That night, back at the house, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in months. Inside was the folded letter from my father's attorney, the one that had accompanied the USB. I unfolded it, reread the brief message, and set it back without reaction. What once had felt like the beginning of reckoning now read like closure. I sat by the window and watched the evening take shape. The streetlights came on. The neighborhood grew quiet. And for the first time in a long while, I realized I wasn't waiting for anything else to arrive. There's a kind of certainty that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition or even acknowledgement. It lives in action sustained over time in how you work, how you speak, how you remain. Sometimes justice doesn't come as a verdict or a moment. Sometimes it's a slow unfolding, a quiet course correction that finally holds. And when it does, it doesn't feel like a triumph. It feels like balance. Sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that change everything, not the kind you announce or celebrate with noise, but the kind that settles deep within, like something finally returning to its rightful place. What happened with my father, my family, and the company wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about restoring something that had been lost, truth, and with truth came space for clarity, for integrity, and maybe one day for healing. I often think about how easily stories get rewritten, how a single voice, repeated often enough, can reshape someone's image until even they begin to believe it. For a long time, I thought I had disappeared from my father's world. Now I know I was always there, just waiting behind the noise. There's a strange kind of strength in staying still when the world demands a reaction, and choosing not to explain yourself until the silence is ready to listen. Maybe that's what changed the course of everything, not confrontation, but endurance. We all carry chapters that others never read, and sometimes the most meaningful acknowledgments come not in the spotlight, but in the quiet restoration of your name, your work, your worth. What would it feel like to be seen clearly, not despite your silence, but because of it? Maybe that's a question worth asking, or maybe it's enough just to know the truth has weight, even when whispered.